Welcome to Module 1, Educational Planning for Development. This presentation will focus on the post-2015 agenda and the changing context and the changing views that have led to the development of this agenda. This is a relatively short presentation which focuses primarily on the Education 2030 agenda. And therefore, our main learning outcome is that after watching this presentation and reading the related materials, you should be able to present the main points of the Education 2030 agenda. You will recall that the EFA, or Education for All goals, that were formulated in Dakar in the year 2000, focused primarily on primary education and gender inequality, but of course also addressing issues of early childhood education, literacy, quality of education, and the learning needs and competencies of youth and adults. We'll see in subsequent slides that the goals that have been set since 2015, when the EFA goals were initially scheduled to be met, have broadened the scope of the education agenda. The post-2015 or post-MDG development goals began to take shape as early as 2012. And resulted in the SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals, which you see on your screen. There are a total of 17 goals, so the agenda is quite broad. Ultimately, of course, the aim is to end poverty and fight inequality. There is also emphasis on tackling climate change and ensuring that countries are able to sustainably develop in ways that are just and equitable. Now, education is specifically mentioned in Goal 4. Ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. However, education is central to achieving many of the SDGs. Education can contribute to the goals of ending poverty, ensuring health and well-being, achieving gender equality, promoting inclusive and sustainable economic growth and employment, ensuring sustainable consumption and production, and mitigating the effects of climate change. Education is therefore not only an integral part of, but also a key enabler for sustainable development, and should be part of the strategies to achieving all SDGs. Teaching students and youth about the protection of the environment, training workers in sustainable farming techniques, building education facilities that are safe, resilient, and sustainable, and promoting peaceful and inclusive societies through education that encourages tolerance and exchange, are some examples of how education can contribute to achieving the SDGs. As mentioned already, goal number 4 is specific to education. And within that goal, there are 7 specific sub-objectives or targets. And the first 3 of these are relevant to specific subsectors. So, primary and secondary education are followed by early childhood development, and then technical, vocational, and tertiary education. The 4th target relates to specific skills for employment and entrepreneurship. The 5th target, or sub-objective of the education goal, focuses on gender disparities in education and on eliminating them in the provision of education, but not only in terms of gender, but also in terms of children with special needs, Indigenous people, and children in vulnerable situations. Targets 6 and 7 are focused on the acquisition of particular learning outcomes, namely literacy and numeracy, and then in the last target, the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development are spelled out. These 7 specific sub-objectives or targets are accompanied by 3 implementation measures, because it is considered that 3 types of resources and a much wider set of resources will need to be made available in order to achieve the goal and the specific targets. The first relates to education facilities, the second to scholarships, and the third one to the supply of qualified teachers. This slide aims to show that the education agenda, over the years since the MDGs and the EFA goals were set in 2000, and to the development in 2015 of the Education 2030 agenda, that this agenda has essentially broadened in scope. So the education aspect of the MDGs focused on the provision of free primary education and gender equality. The EFA goals were somewhat broader, focusing as well on early childhood, education quality, literacy of adults, and learning needs of youth and adults. But the World Education Forum in Incheon went beyond that and defined broader objectives for Education 2030, which includes free secondary education and the fight against marginalization and exclusion, which also pays more attention to the need to be able to respond to crisis situation and which also, to some extent, makes governance clearly responsible for providing some basic resources to the education system. So when compared to the EFA goals, the Education 2030 agenda resulted from a more inclusive participatory process, covers more subsectors more deeply, has a greater emphasis on quality, and pays attention as well to key resources, such as teachers. Another difference is that the agenda addresses all countries, not just developing countries. However, in the way that they are formulated, the goals and targets are less concrete, less clear, and therefore they are more difficult to measure. How will progress towards the education objectives of the 2030 Agenda be measured? How will they be monitored and evaluated? Well, just recently, a rather demanding framework was developed, with over 40 thematic indicators having been adopted in late 2016 by the UN General Assembly. A technical working group continues work to create monitoring mechanisms and to coordinate efforts to produce the required data to monitor progress towards SDG 4. So, we can ask ourselves the question, is this new Education 2030 agenda truly a new paradigm? Or is it more of a continuation of previous efforts in 1990 and in 2000? Or is education going to be playing a different role in coming years? We could argue that there are three ways of looking at this new Education 2030 agenda. They are not mutually exclusive, but they are different. The first approach would be to continue looking at education as a specific discipline. A second option would be that education is one of these international public groups that deserves to be internationally financed, such as health and to some extent, such as social protection. A third option is to see education more as an instrument for sustainable development, an essential instrument for sustainable development. Education will contribute to social, economic, and environmental development, and this will make it possible to achieve sustainability. The implications of this for educational planning and for educational financing is something that we will still have to discuss when we meet in Paris a few months from now. Thank you for your attention.